Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Boston. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the winter of 1913, Boston lay under a gray, unrelenting sky. The harbor steamed faintly in the cold morning air, and as dawn broke, a peculiar hush hung over the South End district. Into that silence arrived Edmund Carlisle, a new undertaker recently transferred from Providence, Rhode Island, to take over a modest funeral home on Beechwood Street. His arrival had been quiet, yet local residents recalled the outward stillness: no carriage bells, no flurry of assistants. Only Carlisle stepping from a horse carriage, his tall frame draped in a dark coat, eyes hollow but steady. The house, previously known as Hawthorne Sons Undertaking, had passed through several hands, first old Mr. Hawthorne, then his widow, and for the past 3 years to a Mr. J. F. Emery, a local mortician whose reputation had grown increasingly uneasy. Records show Emery had debts, and neighbors whispered that clients sometimes retracted calls for his services, alleging odd smells or delays. In the ledger, one entry simply reads, "Body held. Terms unknown." Carlisle made his base upstairs, using the upper rooms for laying out bodies. He seemed introverted but precise. One neighbor, Mrs. Lydia Caldwell, remembered. He looked as though he were made of shadow, never spoke but once, quite curtly, when I asked after his arrival. By February, odd reports began. Lovers of late-night walks heard muffled groans in the alley behind the funeral home. A local constable, George Milton, logged a complaint. Some say the smell of chemicals, formalin or ether, drifts past the windows at midnight. But the region had seen many undertakers, and such whispers were often dismissed as exaggeration. By early March of 1913, Beechwood Street had grown uneasy. Residents spoke in lowered tones about the dim light burning in the funeral home at all hours. Delivery boys refused to approach after dusk, claiming they heard the sound of a saw scraping through wood when no coffins were being built. According to fragments in the old Suffolk County records, Carlisle ordered an unusually high amount of preservation fluid, far beyond what a small neighborhood mortician would need. An invoice from the Boston Chemical Company, dated March 4th, lists 30 gallons of formaldehyde solution, signed with a shaky hand and a blot of ink. That blot would later be cited as evidence of distraction by an inspector, though at the time it passed unnoticed. The property itself was a curious structure: brick frontage, narrow hallways, cellar cut deep into the frozen ground. Former owner J. F. Emery had built a reinforced room below, allegedly for cold storage. A carpenter named Leonard Doyle, who worked briefly during the renovation, gave a short affidavit years later. He asked for a hatch, no larger than a man's shoulders, to be cut into the stone floor, said it was for drainage. I thought it odd, but not my business. When the first real incident occurred, few connected it to the undertaker. A transient woman named Mabel Green vanished after visiting the district seeking work. She was last seen outside the home, speaking with Carlisle near the side gate. The constable's report, now brittle and half-faded, states, "Gentleman claims she inquired about domestic work. No trace since." Her absence joined dozens of cold cases in Boston that year, overshadowed by industrial accidents and influenza deaths. Yet one line from the Boston Evening Transcript hints otherwise. Local residents urge inquiry into new undertakers' conduct. Foul odors continue nightly. It was the first printed suggestion that something within Beechwood Street's quiet house might not be the routine process of death, but something deeply unnatural. Mention of the Lamb Funeral Home scandal from decades later often appears in academic comparison, professors citing similar methods of concealment, similar tampering with bodies for personal fixation rather than profit. In retrospect, the resemblance is chilling. But in 1913, no such framework existed to interpret what Carlisle's habits meant. To most, he was only another solemn tradesman in a city accustomed to grief. By late spring, the neighborhood's patience had thinned. Mr. Benton, who ran the cobbler's shop across the lane, recalled, He never bought bread, never posted a letter. Once, I saw him standing still in the yard at 2 in the morning. His hands were red, not from cold, but thicker, like varnish. The statement was ignored. Benton was known to drink, yet his words, scribbled in the constable's margin, would later appear again in the district inquest of 1921. Records from that inquiry describe something that seems too deliberate for chance. A note found behind a panel of Carlisle's workroom wall. They do not stay gone. Beneath it, dried resin and traces of embalming solution had hardened like wax. Whether it was meant as confession or warning, no one could ever tell. The summer heat that followed was thick and heavy, trapping the odor of the harbor and the embalmer's fluids in the narrow alleys of the South End. By July, townsfolk avoided Beechwood Street altogether, steering their carriages down Tremont instead. The undertaker's curtains remained drawn even in daylight. A thin column of smoke rose from his chimney every evening at the same hour, despite the warmth. Local boys, emboldened by curiosity, dared one another to peer through the cellar windows. One of them, Thomas Kerrigan, later a city porter, told a reporter decades afterward that he had seen white arms laid across a slab, stiff as chalk, yet glistening like porcelain. His story was dismissed as childish exaggeration, but the reporter's notes survive in the archives. Within them, the word polished is underlined twice. In August, a traveling priest named Father Mallory visited the district for routine blessings after an influenza outbreak. He later told the archdiocese that he felt an unholy chill near the undertaker's home, a sense of being observed from behind the drawn lace curtains. He knocked twice, but no one answered. A week later, a faint black residue appeared in the gutter outside the property, described by a city inspector as ash mixed with organic fragments. Still, no complaint was filed. It was Boston in 1913, a city where death's scent was as common as the sea wind. By September, Carlisle's handwriting began to deteriorate in the death registers. Clerks at City Hall noticed erratic pen strokes and inconsistent notations of cause. One line read simply, "Body beyond standard measure." Another, "Preservation satisfactory, rest unfit." No official challenged him. The bureaucracy of mortality was too thick for curiosity. Only Dr. Harold Renner, a pathologist at the Massachusetts General Hospital, raised concern after an unclaimed corpse arrived with traces of unfamiliar embalming compounds. He sent a letter to the Board of Health suggesting that certain private morticians are experimenting beyond regulation. The letter was filed, stamped, and forgotten. The Lamb Funeral Home scandal, many decades later, would remind investigators how easily institutions overlook the quiet malice of those entrusted with the dead. That scandal, with its burned records and hidden chambers, seemed to echo what had already passed unnoticed on Beechwood Street. By the autumn equinox, the house had gone entirely silent. The smoke ceased. Deliveries stopped. Even the odor, so constant for months, vanished. For a time, the neighborhood believed Carlisle had left. Then one morning in late October, a wagon pulled by a gray horse stood outside, piled high with wooden boxes marked medical supplies. The driver said no words, signed no papers, and drove north toward the river. The house remained locked. When winter came again, a thin frost coated the inside of the front windows. Behind it, faint outlines of furniture and instruments could be seen, undisturbed but coated in dust. It was as if time had sealed the building from within. It was early January when the Board of Health finally intervened. A lingering illness in the district prompted a sweep inspection of all undertakers' facilities. When officers arrived at Beechwood Street, they found the door bolted from the inside. The windows were clouded, the air dense with the smell of rot and chemical residue that clung to their coats for days. Constable Milton, the same who had logged complaints a year before, noted in his journal, "The lock gave little resistance. The house was empty, yet it felt as if someone had just stepped away." Inside, they found 4 tables, each marked with shallow impressions in the dust where bodies once lay. Glass jars lined the shelves, some filled with pale liquid, others dry and sealed. A single ledger sat open on the counter. Its pages were half erased, smudged as though by trembling fingers. The earliest entries matched the city's burial lists, but later ones bore initials only. No surnames, and no dates of interment. Beneath the final entry, the ink had pooled into a black tear that soaked through 2 layers of paper. The basement was worse. The hatch that Carpenter Doyle once cut had been expanded. The earth around it showed signs of recent digging, and the soil reeked faintly of lime and ether. One inspector, James Collard, recorded in affidavit, "The floor beneath was not stone but bone, arranged as if in deliberate fashion, aligned to the walls." The statement was dismissed as hysteria, but Collard never returned to work after that day. He left Boston, his resignation unsigned. Word of the discovery spread quietly, buried beneath larger headlines of labor strikes and political scandal. Only a few lines appeared in the Boston Globe, referring to an abandoned mortuary of peculiar condition. The article named no one, though locals knew who had occupied the premises. Soon after, the city boarded the windows and padlocked the entrance. For years the structure stood untouched, its sign half-rotted, letters barely visible. Carlisle Undertaking. When the property was finally auctioned in 1919, the buyer, a shipping merchant named Alistair Pruitt, attempted to convert the space into storage. Within a week, he reported sounds beneath the floor, dripping water, shifting boards, the faint clatter of glass. Laborers refused to enter after dusk. In his statement to police, Pruitt wrote, "It was not the odor that frightened me, but the feeling that something was working behind the walls, slow and patient." His report, like many before, was filed and forgotten. Decades later, criminologists studying the Lamb Funeral Home scandal would refer back to this case as an unacknowledged precursor, a moment when neglect, secrecy, and obsession converged into something unspeakable. Whether Carlisle fled, died, or was consumed by his own experimentations remains unknown. No death certificate under his name was ever issued in Massachusetts or Rhode Island. Only a small notation in Providence records survives. Inquiry received. No record found. By the mid-1920s, the Beechwood property had fallen into disrepair. Children called it the House of the Quiet Man, a place where even echoes seemed to hesitate. The city considered demolition more than once, but funding and interest both ran thin. Each attempt stalled after contractors reported accidents, a fractured hand, a nail through a boot, one man collapsing from nausea after prying up floorboards. The incidents were never officially linked, though foreman records describe a persistent chemical scent, sour and sweet together. In 1926, a graduate student from Harvard Medical School named Louis Abernathy petitioned to examine the house for his thesis on historical mortuary practices. His supervisor approved, noting that the site offered a rare intact specimen of early 20th century embalming architecture. Abernathy spent 2 nights inside, cataloging instruments left behind. His notes, found years later among university archives, detail the presence of altered equipment, syringes modified for prolonged injection, clamps filed to unnatural sharpness, and several glass jars labeled in fading ink, "Preserve, return, observe." He described the air as metallic, like breathing through coins. On his 3rd day, he left abruptly, returning the keys without explanation. His diary ends with one sentence: "He found a way to listen back." The phrasing puzzled historians, though some liken it to the language used by pathologists during the later Lamb Funeral Home scandal, who claimed to sense the echo of their own handling within the chambers they built. When city officials reopened the property briefly for inventory, they discovered faint impressions beneath the plaster, outlines of hands, forearms, and something pressed near the baseboards, as if the wall itself had absorbed movement. No one stayed longer than necessary. After that, the house was condemned and sealed for good. In 1931, a minor fire gutted the rear wing. The official report called it electrical in nature, though the building had long since been disconnected from power. Only the stone cellar survived intact, its entrance buried beneath ash and debris. In the decades that followed, Boston expanded, and Beechwood Street was renamed as part of an urban renewal project. The old mortuary vanished from maps, replaced by a narrow alley behind a warehouse. Yet older residents continued to mark the spot with unease, saying the air there still tasted of medicine and rust. In 1962, a city maintenance crew uncovered a cracked brass nameplate during excavation. The inscription had nearly worn away, but under strong light, a single word could still be read: Carlisle. The nameplate discovery revived interest in the old Undertaker legend. A brief article appeared in the Boston Herald that autumn under the title Echoes Beneath Beechwood. It summarized the story as neighborhood folklore, but included one new detail: a photograph of the recovered plate alongside fragments of glass resembling antique embalming vials. Within weeks, urban historians and amateur ghost hunters began writing to the city archives requesting access to any surviving files on Edmund Carlisle. Most of the documents had already been lost during the 1931 fire, but a clerk named Margaret Ellis located a single surviving ledger entry referencing the funeral home's tax record for 1913. Scrawled in the margin was a note: pending inspection, possible federal interest. The phrase intrigued researchers because it hinted at involvement by the Bureau of Investigation, precursor to the FBI. Yet no corresponding federal documents have ever surfaced. When Ellis attempted to trace the file number, she found it skipped in sequence, replaced by an unrelated customs report. Whether by coincidence or quiet removal, the trail ended there. Around that same time, the Massachusetts Historical Society began collecting oral testimonies from elderly residents. One man, identified only as R.F., claimed to have been a paperboy in 1914 and remembered seeing Carlisle at dawn, washing something white in the yard, something that looked like a handkerchief but wasn't. His description was too vague to verify, yet it matched the pattern of detail that would later characterize interviews about the Lamb funeral home scandal: fleeting, sensory, always ending in uncertainty. During the 1970s, Beechwood's transformation into an industrial lane erased almost every trace of its past. Yet construction workers occasionally reported digging up fragments of carved wood shaped like coffin handles, 1/4 Man admitted to keeping a few for luck, though he later returned them after claiming his basement began smelling of formaldehyde. No official statement exists, but private letters between the construction company and city sanitation department reference unexplained corrosion of equipment following the Beechwood site dig. The phenomenon was never studied further. By 1984, the area was home to a distribution warehouse. Security guards there told of lights flickering along the northern wall at precisely 2:13 a.m., the same hour Carlisle had once conducted his embalming work, according to recovered invoices. The events drew minor attention in a local magazine feature about haunted industrial sites, which quoted one guard as saying, "You can smell the iron in the air, like someone's mixing blood with water." Decades after the Lamb funeral home scandal had horrified California, Boston's older case resurfaced as a dark precedent, a reminder that depravity often hides not in the sensational, but in the procedural, the quiet rituals of those tasked with caring for the dead. Still, no one has ever proven what Edmund Carlisle truly did inside those walls, or whether the cellar's contents were human, medical, or something else entirely. In 1991, during a city redevelopment project, engineers drilling beneath the warehouse's foundation encountered an unexpected hollow space. The ground sensors registered a chamber roughly 12 feet across, perfectly circular, sealed by layers of compacted ash and lime. Initial speculation pointed to an old cistern, yet when workers broke through, the cavity emitted a faint odor of iron and alcohol. A safety inspector, Thomas Reeves, filed an incident report describing thin air, brittle as glass, and residue resembling embalming fluid. The team evacuated the area, pending environmental analysis, but by the following week, the site was inexplicably refilled and the project relocated 2 blocks north. No public explanation was issued, and the reports were quietly reclassified under subsurface hazard. 2 years later, Reeves left the department after recurring health issues he attributed to chemical exposure. In his private journal, later donated to the Massachusetts Historical Society, he wrote, "It wasn't the air that sickened me, it was the silence." A short paragraph follows, mentioning the name Carlisle in quotation marks, as if whispered. Around the same time, a local historian named Deborah Linwood published a paper drawing parallels between the Beechwood case and the Lamb funeral home scandal. Her argument proposed that Carlisle may have experimented with unregulated preservation compounds, perhaps seeking to extend post-mortem elasticity or delay decomposition indefinitely. Linwood's research, though speculative, gained traction among students of early mortuary science, many citing the same chilling pattern: obsession with preservation, transforming into fixation on the preserved. She noted that, unlike the later California scandal, no financial motive could be proven in Carlisle's case. His practice was too small, his client list too poor. It was not profit, she wrote, but compulsion. A subsequent search for the missing mortician's lineage turned up only one record, an 1880 census entry from Providence listing an Edmund C., age 10, son of a textile dyer. No marriage, no siblings, no burial notice. It was as if the man had entered history solely to vanish within it. In interviews decades later, Linwood recounted visiting the renamed alley where the funeral home once stood. It was mid-afternoon, she said, but it felt like dusk. There was a pressure in the air, as though the street itself remembered. Her paper closed on an ambiguous note, suggesting that the lime-sealed chamber discovered beneath the warehouse might have been Carlisle's final workspace, or his tomb. The city issued no follow-up statement. The coordinates of the site have since been omitted from public maps, replaced by a featureless square of parking lot. Residents still report occasional power failures localized to that single block, usually around late October, when the air turns cold and damp enough to carry scents upward from deep in the ground. In the late 1990s, interest in the case surged again when a Boston University film student, Mara DeSantis, produced a short documentary titled The Undertaker's Silence. She used surviving police notes, tax records, and fragments of the Carlisle ledger that had been preserved by the Historical Society. During filming, her crew gained access to the sub-basement of the old distribution warehouse, by then largely abandoned. What they recorded remains the most contested piece of evidence connected to the story. In the dim light of their camera, the floor appeared to be uneven, as though pressed from beneath. When the footage was reviewed later, faint shapes emerged, outlines that looked like faces under glass, or the effect of air bubbles in hardened resin. One crew member, sound technician Alex Moore, insisted that a low hum had been audible during recording, like breath drawn through water. No such sound was captured on the audio track. The film premiered at a local festival, but was withdrawn within a week after a power surge destroyed the master reel. Only still frames survive, archived in the university's media department. Decades later, students studying the lost film note how similar the imagery was to early reports from the Lamb funeral home scandal: bodies improperly sealed, surfaces reflecting human contours that should not have remained. In interviews before her death in 2009, DeSantis maintained that nothing supernatural occurred. The horror, she said, was the precision. It wasn't madness, it was method. Her words echo the sentiment that historians and criminologists still attach to Edmund Carlisle, a figure representing the point where professionalism becomes pathology. In 2003, a private collector purchased several artifacts labeled as Beechwood instruments at an estate sale in Cambridge. Among them was a scalpel etched with initials EC, its handle Ds, scolored by what testing later revealed to be trace elements of mercury and arsenic, both used in early embalming formulations. The collector, who requested anonymity, claimed that soon after acquiring the items, the temperature in his storage room dropped inexplicably each night, as if the metal itself exhaled cold. He eventually donated the tools to the medical museum at Harvard, where they remain in a locked drawer marked Provenance Unverified. When the museum catalogued the objects, they found a folded slip of paper inside one of the cases. The ink was nearly gone, but under ultraviolet light, a single sentence could be read: "To keep them as they were, I must stay as I am." Whether written by Carlisle or a later archivist, no one could determine. That note reignited speculation that the Undertaker had intended not merely to preserve bodies, but to arrest decay entirely, to exist in a stasis of his own making. Modern forensic experts dismiss such theories as romanticized myth, Yet even skeptics admit the chemical signatures found at the site do not correspond to any known embalming mixture of that era. A quiet unease lingers among those who handle the surviving artifacts. Some staff refuse to enter the storage room alone. One curator reportedly said, "It smells faintly of medicine when the lights go off." In 2010, a minor electrical fire in the museum basement forced a temporary relocation of the Carlisle artifacts. During inventory, a curator named Helen Partridge noticed that the scalpel's metal had darkened unevenly, as if reacting to moisture. Laboratory analysis found traces of organic residue embedded deep within the blade's grooves, too degraded for DNA extraction, yet distinctly human. The discovery reignited speculation in Boston's academic circles, prompting local journalists to revisit the long-dormant case. One investigative piece published in the Atlantic Beacon proposed that Carlisle might have used his own blood as part of his experimental preservatives, citing parallels to forgotten 19th-century vitalist practices that sought to retain fragments of living tissue during embalming. The article quoted from a forgotten 1914 letter recovered in the archives of Massachusetts General Hospital, addressed anonymously to Dr. Harold Renner, the same pathologist who had raised early concerns. The letter read, "I have found the balance between stillness and remembrance. If the body may not breathe, the air may remember it." Its signature was only the letter C. Forensic handwriting analysis compared it to known samples from the Carlisle ledger and concluded with probable authorship. By 2012, the museum sealed the artifacts and withdrew them from display after a visitor claimed faint impressions appeared on the inside of the glass case, as though something had pressed outward. Maintenance logs confirmed the smudges, though cameras recorded nothing unusual. The museum's official statement referred to humidity distortions. Yet behind the scenes, staff began referring to the storage wing as the cold hall. Several employees requested transfers. Around this time, historian Deborah Linwood, now elderly and confined to assisted living, gave her final recorded interview, and she spoke softly, her voice trembling not from fear, but from weariness. "Every generation thinks it's the first to touch the dead scientifically," she said, "but the arrogance is always the same. Carlisle only went further because no one told him to stop." When asked if she believed he survived, she paused for nearly a minute before replying, "Perhaps not in the way we think of surviving." After her death the following year, her papers were donated to the Historical Society. Among them was an unmarked envelope containing a brittle photograph, sepia-toned, its edges curling. It showed a narrow room with stone walls and a figure standing behind a slab, face turned slightly away, indistinct but tall. Across the bottom margin, in faded ink, someone had written, "Beechwood, 1913. Photographic experts confirmed the plate was genuine and of the correct period, though they could not identify the subject. One historian observed that the man's hands appeared blurred, as though moving at the time of exposure, yet the rest of the image was perfectly still. In that subtle motion, the entire legend seemed to breathe again, if only for an instant. In 2015, a restoration team digitizing early 20th century photographs at the Massachusetts Historical Society revisited the Beechwood print for inclusion in a digital archive. During high-resolution scanning, the technician noted faint indentations on the photo's reverse side, marks invisible to the naked eye but arranged in deliberate rows. Forensic imaging revealed the impressions to be writing, pressed so lightly it had never pierced the paper. The text, deciphered under angled light, read, "Sequence continues beneath. Silence is preservation." The phrasing sent archivists back to compare it with other period documents. The handwriting again aligned with Carlisle's. The discovery reignited public fascination, leading local journalists to dub the revived story Boston's Unfinished Embalmer. The renewed attention drew both skeptics and enthusiasts. Forums and podcasts debated whether the Undertaker had indeed been experimenting with chemical forms of suspended decay, a notion that blurred science and mysticism. Around this time, urban explorers sought out the supposed remains of Beechwood Street, though redevelopment had erased nearly every trace. One group claimed to have found a sealed drainage access beneath the warehouse lot, still lined with original stonework. Their uploaded footage showed nothing conclusive, only a tunnel filled with stagnant water and a single rusted clamp half buried in silt. But among the last frames, a faint reflection appeared in the water's surface, an oval glint resembling an eye. The clip circulated briefly before being removed, allegedly at the request of city officials citing trespassing laws. Yet for weeks afterward, workers in nearby buildings complained of an acrid odor rising from the drains each night, like wet steel and disinfectant. No leaks were found. The Lamb funeral home scandal, by then a century distant, resurfaced once, more in commentary pieces, comparing how both cases revealed the same institutional blindness, how regulatory systems ignored what they deemed improbable. Academics wrote that Carlisle's disappearance was not a supernatural vanishing, but a bureaucratic one, the quiet erasure of a man who operated between the lines of record-keeping. In late 2016, a retired forensic chemist named Arthur Venn published a technical note examining the surviving embalming formulas referenced in the old ledgers. He identified traces of chloroform, arsenic, and mercury salts, but also a compound he could not replicate, a mixture that left a crystalline film resistant to heat and moisture. "The substance behaves like a mirror," he wrote, reflecting not light, but time. The remark, likely metaphorical, nonetheless captured the essence of what the Beechwood case had become, a mirror into which Boston occasionally glanced, catching its own reflection dimmed by chemical haze. In subsequent years, redevelopment once again overtook the site. The warehouse was demolished, replaced by a small parking structure. Yet security guards there still mention quietly that some mornings a pale residue coats the pavement near the north wall, forming thin hand-shaped outlines that evaporate with the sun. By 2018, the Beechwood case had migrated fully into the digital realm, where researchers, skeptics, and storytellers debated its fragments across forums and archives. One anonymous contributor, claiming to be the descendant of a former city clerk, uploaded several scanned pages from an unprocessed evidence binder dated 1914. The pages included rough sketches of the funeral home's cellar, drawn from memory by an unnamed inspector, and a brief list labeled Recovered Personal Effects. Among them were a pocket watch, a brass syringe, and what was described simply as skin fragment, pliant. Whether the item referred to preserved human tissue or something else entirely was unclear, but the notation's calm precision was deeply unsettling. The thread that followed swelled with speculation before the images were removed for copyright reasons. Yet the discussion rekindled broader academic interest. In early 2019, a team from Northeastern University launched a funded project to catalog unsolved professional disappearances in early 20th century Massachusetts. Carlisle's name surfaced once again, cross-referenced with Providence business directories, customs manifests, and ship passenger lists. In April of that year, they located an entry from 1915 for a vessel bound to Halifax carrying a medical demonstrator named E. Carlisle, age 35. The handwriting matched his known signature, but no arrival record existed at the Canadian port. For some, that single inconsistency provided the final mystery, proof that he had either perished at sea or disembarked under another identity. Yet others saw a more haunting possibility, that the record itself had been fabricated, a clerical placeholder to close an investigation quietly. When the findings were published, a local Boston radio host aired a special on the case, reading excerpts from the original constable logs. The broadcast drew thousands of listeners who described the same peculiar experience, a faint rhythmic sound behind the narrator's voice, like water tapping metal. Engineers later confirmed no interference on the recording. Whether coincidence or echo, the incident cemented the case's reputation as Boston's most elusive, unsolved file. By the 2020s, modern historians had begun reassessing Carlisle not as a villain, but as a grim reflection of his time, a craftsman consumed by the science of halting decay. His obsession paralleled the technological optimism of the era, when chemists, morticians, and anatomists all sought permanence against nature's unraveling. The Lamb funeral home scandal, often cited in the same academic breath, illustrated how those ambitions could turn monstrous when left unchecked. Where the California case ended in exposure and prosecution, Boston's remained buried, its truths literally sealed in lime. A century later, the question persisted: did Edmund Carlisle seek to preserve death, or to linger within it? The distinction, historians admit, may be irrelevant. On quiet nights near the Old South End, when the fog drifts inland and the streetlights dim, locals say the air thickens for a moment, as if the city itself pauses to hold its breath. By 2021, interest in the Beechwood affair had turned almost archaeological. Independent researchers began employing ground-penetrating radar along the narrow alley once mapped as Beechwood Street. Their scans revealed irregular voids beneath the asphalt, 3 narrow rectangles positioned parallel, like trenches or chambers. Permits for excavation were denied due to structural risk, yet leaked images circulated online, showing faint metallic readings in the soil. Speculation mounted that these could be remnants of Carlisle's hidden workspace, perhaps even discarded instruments. A local historian, Peter Lang, attempted to petition the city for supervised access, arguing that the preservation of evidence is itself an act of remembrance. His request went unanswered. Within weeks, the area was resurfaced, erasing any trace of the dig. Lang later told colleagues that he had received an unmarked envelope containing a single photograph, grainy, seemingly taken at night, showing a concrete slab with what appeared to be a handprint pressed into its center. He never revealed the sender. In a 2022 symposium on early mortuary science, scholars revisited both the Beechwood case and the Lamb Funeral Home scandal as cautionary parallels. 2 moments separated by decades, but bound by the same blindness to obsession. One paper suggested that Carlisle's techniques might have influenced underground practitioners in the 1920s, citing oral accounts of Boston preservers who sold private embalming formulas across New England. While no link could be verified, chemical similarities were noted in preserved anatomical samples stored at several universities. The idea that his legacy might have persisted invisibly, folded into legitimate science, disturbed even seasoned historians. In 2023, a minor flood in the South End uncovered fragments of foundation stone near the warehouse lot. City Mainto. Nance crews photographed the exposed masonry before refilling the area. In one image, a faint engraving can be seen, the letters EC etched in an uneven line, followed by a shallow curve like the start of another word that time erased. The photo was archived without comment, but when an online researcher enhanced the contrast, a ghostly outline seemed to form beside the initials, almost like a second set, mirrored faintly to the right, as though carved from inside the stone. For months after, residents of the nearby apartments complained of power fluctuations around midnight and a smell described as old antiseptic. Engineers blamed outdated wiring and stagnant water beneath the foundation, yet the timing, always the same hour Carlisle's lamps once burned, fed the story's persistence. Even the city's tourism board, reluctantly acknowledging public curiosity, added a discreet footnote on its Hidden Histories of Boston walking tour. Approximate site of Beechwood Undertaking, established 1913, closed under unusual circumstances. The guide offers no elaboration, yet visitors often report that when standing near the north corner of the lot, cell phone signals falter and a brief chill settles in the air, colder than the rest of the block. Whether it is mere coincidence or the residue of forgotten experiments, no one can say. In the winter of 2024, a graduate team from Emerson College began compiling an oral history series titled Unwritten Boston, focused on unsolved urban folklore. The Beechwood case became their most requested subject. Dozens of interviewees, descendants of former residents, retired police clerks, even an aging construction foreman, shared their recollections. None could agree on the exact location of the old funeral home, yet each remembered something peculiar, a sense of pressure in the air near that block, as if the atmosphere thickened momentarily when one lingered too long. The team recorded ambient audio at the site one evening in December. Playback revealed an intermittent thrum beneath the city noise, a slow, rhythmic pulse lasting 8 seconds, then silence. Audio engineers described it as mechanical interference, though no equipment nearby could have produced it. The students titled the clip Beechwood Frequency, and though skeptics dismissed it as myth-making, the sound carried an uncanny symmetry, repeating precisely every 24 hours when rechecked on site. The phenomenon vanished after a week, just as quietly as it had begun. Around that same time, a digital archivist named Henry Voss uncovered a misfiled document in the Suffolk County Register, a damage report from March 1914, describing the retrieval of several sealed vessels of unknown compound from a South End property. The form bore an embossed seal reading Health Inspection Division, District 3, the same division responsible for Carlisle's area. Under the remarks column, someone had written in pencil, "Reagent stable, subject missing." The handwriting again matched prior samples. Voss's discovery made brief headlines before being overshadowed by larger news, yet it spurred one last academic conference that spring. At the gathering, Professor Miriam Howe presented a paper arguing that Carlisle represented a transitional archetype, the mortician who blurred preservation and possession. She drew a careful line to the later Lamb Funeral Home scandal, noting that both cases revealed a strange intimacy between the living and the dead, how the attempt to maintain dignity after death can twist into the desire to control it. Carlisle's tragedy, she concluded, is not that he was monstrous, but that he believed the still body could hold memory longer than flesh. Her words were quoted widely, and for a brief moment the Undertaker's name re-entered scholarly discourse. Then, as always, silence reclaimed it. By summer, redevelopment crews began preparing for new construction on the same site, a small complex of offices and apartments. During initial excavation, workers uncovered a compact layer of discolored soil and what appeared to be a rusted hinge, fused shut with mineral deposits. The hinge was photographed and discarded with the debris. The supervisor's field log noted a single observation: smell of ether, brief, no source, nothing more. The project resumed without interruption. Today, those offices stand quietly, their tenants unaware that beneath their parking garage lies the compressed strata of a story too incomplete to resolve, too enduring to forget. Some evenings, janitors report a faint tapping in the walls near the sub-level storage rooms. They describe it not as threatening, but methodical, like someone patiently working, still intent on perfecting their craft. By late 2024, construction of the new complex was nearly complete when an electrician, running conduit along the lower service corridor, struck something metallic embedded within the concrete. Assuming it was rebar, he chipped at the surface until a dull bronze disc appeared, about the size of a coin, fixed flush with the floor. When pried loose, it revealed a circular plate beneath, engraved faintly with letters almost erased by corrosion. E. Carlisle, 1913. The worker, uneasy, turned it over and found beneath a thin film of translucent residue that seemed to shimmer under light. Environmental tests later described the substance as a complex, polymerized organic compound, though no one could determine its origin. The disc was quietly taken by site supervisors and never returned to inventory. That same week, a security camera facing the sub-level hallway recorded a flicker, brief but sharp, where the plate had been found. Technicians attributed it to lens flare, though the timestamp showed 2:13 a.m., the familiar hour that had recurred throughout the story's long timeline. A journalist from the Boston Chronicle, researching redevelopment irregularities, caught wind of the find and attempted to verify it. The property management company denied any knowledge, but her follow-up request was met with an unsigned letter delivered to her office containing only a photograph. The same corridor, the lights dim, a faint silhouette reflected in the polished concrete. She published nothing, but a month later transferred to another paper in Maine. When asked years later, she said simply, "Some stories close themselves." In early 2025, urban historians convened for a centennial symposium marking the unofficial end of the Beechwood inquiry. The discussion focused on the enduring fascination with unverified legacies, why certain cases, like the Lamb Funeral Home scandal, become cautionary tales, while others, like Carlisle's, dissolve into myth. Dr. Evelyn Cross, who had studied both, summarized the sentiment succinctly. Where the Lamb case left evidence of crime, Beechwood left evidence of method. It's the absence of outrage that unsettles us most. Her words hung in the auditorium, echoing through a silence that felt almost reverent. Later that year, a group of architecture students touring the South End for a preservation project visited the complex built atop the original site. In one of the service stairwells, they discovered an exposed section of wall where moisture had lifted a thin layer of paint. Beneath it lay old brickwork, and carved faintly into one of the bricks was a sequence of symbols, 3 overlapping circles connected by a single vertical line. The marks matched diagrams from Carlisle's own notebooks, referencing chemical cycles of containment. Whether coincidence or not, the image spread quickly online, reigniting speculation that parts of the original structure still survived inside the foundation. Maintenance crews repainted the wall within days. When asked, the building superintendent laughed it off, but his written maintenance log contained one unusual remark. Area sealed due to persistent odor resembling antiseptic. We'll revisit after ventilation. Residents of the new apartments occasionally mention that their elevators pause for a fraction of a second between floors, lights dimming just long enough for reflections to blur in the steel doors. They call it the Beechwood breath. In early 2025, only weeks after the wall carving was sealed, reports surfaced from tenants describing a new and inexplicable phenomenon. At precisely the same hour each night, 2:13 a.m., a faint electrical hum spread through the lower floors. Appliances clicked on by themselves, thermostats flickered, and motion sensors registered movement in empty hallways. Building maintenance dismissed it as interference from the underground power grid, but the pattern persisted, always beginning near the service stairwell, where the markings had been found. One resident, a nurse named Clara Iverson, recorded the sound using her phone. The audio, later analyzed by an acoustics expert, contained a low pulse that repeated in threes, measured, deliberate, like the rhythm of a slow heartbeat. When amplified, the pulse revealed faint harmonics, resembling the resonance of human vocal cords submerged in liquid. Iverson moved out 2 weeks later, leaving her apartment lease unsigned. Around that time, city historian Peter Lang, who had once been denied access to excavate the site, received a plain envelope in his university mailbox containing a single printed line: "Preservation achieved." The return address matched no known sender. He contacted local authorities, who filed the message as a hoax. Yet within months, Lang disappeared during a research trip to Providence. His car was found parked near the river, doors locked, keys inside. The only item missing from his belongings was his notebook on the Beechwood investigation. Authorities ruled the case unresolved. By summer, the building's management quietly commissioned an inspection of the substructure, citing moisture retention. Contractors reported sections of the foundation that appeared newly discolored, as if reacting to internal heat. One worker claimed the concrete felt warm to the touch, despite ambient temperatures below freezing. Another reported hearing a soft clinking sound, like glass tapping glass, coming from within the wall. Their supervisor noted the complaints, but halted the inspection, explaining that the findings did not align with contract scope. A week later, the incident files vanished from the company's database. It was around this point that a small community of online researchers began describing a pattern that seemed too coincidental to ignore. Over the past century, every major reference to Edmund Carlisle, the ledger rediscovery, the film footage, the excavation photographs, had surfaced and then vanished at intervals of roughly 12 years. Each cycle ended with the documented loss of material evidence. Some argued this timing matched the half-life of certain mercury compounds found in early embalming solutions, suggesting a chemical explanation for recurring corrosion and anomalies. Others preferred a metaphorical view, that the case itself was trapped in a cycle of reappearance and decay, echoing Carlisle's rumored pursuit of eternal preservation. In interviews that autumn, Dr. Evelyn Cross reflected on that theory with a kind of weary fascination. "It isn't that he refused death," she said. "He refused forgetting, and perhaps in that he succeeded." As winter approached, the building on the former Beechwood site stood quiet again. The hum stopped. The air cleared. For the first time in months, nothing strange was reported. Yet one December morning, the janitorial staff discovered condensation on the inside of a basement window, a film that, when wiped away, left the faint outline of a hand. The handprint on the basement window remained for several days, reappearing each morning no matter how often it was cleaned. It was small, delicate, not like that of a man's, yet somehow deliberate, pressed flat as if from within the glass rather than upon it. The building supervisor photographed it once, then stopped mentioning it altogether. Maintenance logs from that week contain only the brief note: moisture intrusion persists, no visible leak. Around the same time, residents on the upper floors began to report faint smells drifting through the ventilation system: chemical, antiseptic, sweet, and metallic. Complaints reached property management, who ordered a full HVAC flush, but the odor continued intermittently, always near the hour past midnight. An elderly tenant, Mr. Burnham, told a visiting electrician, "It's like the air remembers something." The remark was written off as confusion, but when the technician entered the basement to inspect the ducts, his handheld device registered an unaccountable temperature drop of 15 degrees in a 10-foot radius around the service stairwell. By the following week, work orders for the basement were suspended. Meanwhile, online interest surged once more. A short investigative podcast series released that spring, The Undertaker Below, revisited the Beechwood case from the beginning, weaving Carlisle's known history with the more recent disturbances. Its final episode ended with a field recording captured by the host, a brief clip of static resolving into a slow, deliberate tapping sound. The pattern, analyzed by audio engineers, matched the rhythm documented in earlier archival notes: 3 taps, pause, 3 taps again. To those familiar with the century-old ledger, the sequence was unmistakable. It was the same pattern Carlisle had used in his margin annotations, dividing lists of experimental compounds. Within days of the episode's release, the podcast was taken offline without explanation. Archived copies remain incomplete, the final minute corrupted by digital noise that some listeners claim forms faint, whisper-like syllables when slowed. Scholars who study the Lamb funeral home scandal often cite these later developments as examples of how historical trauma migrates into folklore, reshaping itself for each generation. Yet what makes the Beechwood story endure is its restraint. There are no overt ghosts, no confirmed crimes, only documents, substances, and patterns that resist decay. In 2025, a small exhibit titled Preservation and Silence opened at the Boston Historical Museum, featuring artifacts related to early mortuary science. Among the displayed items was an unmarked glass vial filled with yellowing fluid, labeled simply Source Unknown, South End, Scar 1913. The accompanying placard made no mention of Carlisle, yet the curator privately acknowledged that the vial's contents matched chemical traces from the original Beechwood site. Visitors describe an inexplicable chill when standing before the case, a fleeting pressure behind the eyes like the onset of tears. It may be suggestion, or perhaps something subtler, the echo of a method perfected too well. When the museum closes each night, the security cameras sometimes catch a faint reflection in the glass of the exhibit, tall, indistinct, unmoving. In the spring of 2025, the exhibit at the Boston Historical Museum drew modest crowds, curiosity seekers, historians, and a few who remembered the older stories whispered about Beechwood Street. One evening during a staff inventory, the night guard noticed the vial in the mortuary display had shifted position by several inches. Security footage confirmed that the case had remained sealed. No alarm was triggered. No one had approached. The guard filed his report quietly, unsure whether to mention what else he saw. Condensation forming on the inside of the glass, spelling out a brief shape like a letter before fading, perhaps a C, perhaps nothing. The museum dismissed it as moisture from fluctuating humidity. Yet over the following week, similar incidents occurred. A faint discoloration appeared in the paper of one archival ledger, spreading outward like a bruise. Metallic instruments dulled overnight, and the scent of formalin briefly filled the eastern wing, though no chemicals were stored nearby. The curators grew uneasy but said nothing publicly, fearing sensational press. Behind the scenes, one researcher began cross-referencing those anomalies with environmental readings taken around the same hour each night. Every fluctuation aligned precisely with 2:13 a.m. The museum quietly increased security, but the disturbances soon ceased as suddenly as they had begun. A few weeks later, an anonymous envelope arrived at the front desk containing a single photograph printed on matte paper. It showed a dimly lit corridor, brick walls, tiled floor, and at the far end, a door slightly ajar. The only inscription on the back read, "You sealed the room, not the air." Experts examining the photograph concluded that it depicted an older section of the museum's basement, one closed decades earlier during renovations. When maintenance attempted to access it, they discovered the doorway existed exactly as shown, though the corridor beyond had been bricked off long ago. The photo was archived, not displayed, though whispers circulated among staff that the image would occasionally reappear in internal files even after deletion. As the museum prepared to rotate its exhibits, the vial was quietly withdrawn for conservation, placed in a lead-lined container, and transferred to storage at an undisclosed facility. The curator who signed the transfer later remarked that the glass felt unnaturally cold, as though chilled from within. No further records mention its location. By midsummer, the Beechwood legend once again receded into quiet academic obscurity. Online discussions dwindled, interest shifted to newer mysteries, and the public forgot. Yet every few months, maintenance crews at the museum report finding a faint chemical odor near the sealed archive room, sharp and antiseptic, gone within moments. Those who have worked late in that section say the air grows still just before closing, and a soft echo travels down the hall, steady and methodical, as if someone were taking notes with a pen that no longer exists. Late in 2025, as autumn deepened over Boston, renovation began once more in the museum's archive wing. Contractors pried open sections of flooring long untouched since the building's construction. Beneath the planks, they found layers of ash and dust, and buried in the insulation, an object that should not have been there, a brass tag engraved with a single phrase, "Preserved to remember." The phrase matched a line found in the margin of Carlisle's original ledger, thought lost since 1914. The tag was photographed, bagged, and sent for documentation, but within 24 hours it vanished from the holding office without record of retrieval. Security cameras recorded nothing but a faint light flare crossing the frame at precisely 2:13 a.m. After that night, museum staff reported a soft ticking from the empty display room, sometimes mistaken for a dripping pipe, sometimes for the faint scratch of a pen. An inspection found no mechanical source. The sound came and went unpredictably, yet always seemed to follow a rhythm, a careful, patient pulse that reminded one curator of someone at work behind a desk. By winter, the museum closed the lower archives for renovation and released no further statements. Outside, on the streets of the South End, life continued as it always had. The old warehouses had become apartments. Beechwood Street remained unmarked, a mere alignment of shadows between buildings. Yet city workers clearing storm drains that December found fragments of glass, small and curved, washed up from beneath the pavement. When arranged together, they formed the top edge of a jar, its curvature identical to those used in early 20th century embalming sets. The fragments were photographed, catalogued, and forgotten. For a century, the Beechwood case has refused finality, its evidence surfacing in waves, each time eroded by bureaucracy or disinterest. The Lamb Funeral, all home scandal, long studied as a cautionary tale, left indictments and confessions. Carlisle's story left only residue, chemical, archival, psychological. Historians still argue whether he was a man of science or obsession, whether his disappearance marked escape or transformation. None can say. The last verifiable entry in any record under his name remains that faint ink blot on the ledger's final page, the one shaped like a tear. Boston has changed since then, streets renamed, foundations replaced, but sometimes, on fog nights when the harbor mist creeps inland, locals claim the air near the South End grows unusually still, heavy with the faint odor of formalin and cold iron. They call it the Undertaker's Hour. And in that silence, when the city pauses between breaths, a few say they can almost hear it, the quiet, deliberate rhythm of a pen scratching in the dark. finishing a sentence that has never truly ended.